Hey, welcome, Duvid here. Welcome to a conversation with Jennifer Scharf. I've been looking forward to this for over a week about reincarnation and the mind as a quantum computer. Anyone's been following my series this summer knows that I did like 10 videos on consciousness after my debate on evolution with JF, and I really wanted to get to the modern scientific understanding of how the brain works, how consciousness works, and from there to move into more spiritual topics. And I apologize, my camera seems to be having some issue, so it'd just be the voice with the avatar. But yeah, I met this wonderful woman, Jennifer, through a mutual live stream that we were on together, and we ended up talking quite a bit. And she told me about her interest in reincarnation and her background in physics. And we spoke at length on another channel, the Babscast. And so I thought it'd be interesting to speak with her on my channel, and hopefully, Jennifer could give her a brief biography introduction to herself to the viewers.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, David. My name is Jen. For those of you who don't know me, I started my work in physics when I went to university. I have a degree in physics math. That was at University of Ottawa. I didn't really specialize in anything, but I already had a pretty keen interest at the time in discovering the nature of consciousness and looking at those kinds of questions. I worked as an interpreter for deaf people who were attending university classes for about 10 years as well as worked for the government in the capacity of a forensic scientist. So I would receive evidence and perform comparisons between voices as well as video, as well as analysis. So I don't want to go into that too much. It's not super relevant to what we're talking about today, but the aspect of signal processing does come up in consciousness, as well as several other somewhat complicated ideas. So what I've tried to do is to present the information in a way that's more intuitive for an audience that isn't really familiar with physics. And if you want to get into it a little bit deeper, somewhere down the line, you will have to learn some amount of linear algebra as well as physical geometry. And that's because when you go to apply these things, you have to understand how they work together. So there's an aspect of it that's covered by what's called the vector calculus or just regular linear algebra. And without going into that too much for the beginning, we can define a few terms, which would be consciousness itself, what that means, as well as reincarnation. So if you want to start with the idea of consciousness, there's a lot of other words that can come up when you're talking about consciousness, like a soul. And I just define that all as the same thing. I consider the consciousness it's either equal to the soul or it's a part of the soul, but essentially it's the same thing. It's the entity that experiences your experience. So the kind of like the feeling of localization that you get maybe right behind your eyes and your nose, that the feeling that there's kind of a fountain of consciousness coalescing at that one location. That's what I mean when I say consciousness. It's referring to subjective consciousness.
Yeah, so let's. We'll try to get very clear definitions. Moving forward, just people who watch my public study sessions know I usually find PowerPoints, and I'll find PowerPoints from very beginning levels, like a high school introduction, to very complicated levels, because there's different levels of understanding. And obviously something like consciousness, everybody, even a little kid, could understand, because we're talking about something that's intrinsic to every person that they could intuit. Although at the higher level, it's basically all mathematical formulas and complicated mathematics. In the formal scientific papers that are produced are extremely complicated science that not only require knowledge of quantum mechanics, physics. People need advanced calculus and so on and so on. However, the basic concepts are understandable even if a person has almost no background in science. So hopefully we could get into, you were talking about your view of consciousness and your reincarnation, and obviously I have a Judeo background, although I study Hinduism, and we both have interest in yoga. Um, to look at the soul as some sort of separate part from the body, that usually, like reincarnation, like the classic dualist Descartes, who thought that there was a spiritual realm and a physical realm, and the soul and thought and these ideas of consciousness don't derive from the physical, they derive from the spiritual. And historically, a lot of the scriptures, and like Descartes held, it was the pineal gland that was the transmitter from the spiritual to the physical realm. However, it seems to be that reincarnation implies that there's this separate unit attached to us that's spiritual, that survives death and isn't connected to our physical body. Hence, it's something that's not part of the physical brain or body that could survive death and would be capable of, so to say, moving into another body. And I don't know.
Yes, that's exactly what it would be saying. There's kind of two views, and then within one of the views, there's several different branches of it. There's the purely physical view, and that's basically, like, it's been mostly debunked, the idea that there's nothing more than physics, there's nothing more than the physical universe, there's nothing more than what we can see, and consciousness is simply something that is emergent from our body, i.e. it's produced by the body, it's created by the body, it originates in the body, and it dies when the body dies. And then there's the view that there's a physical realm as well as there's different words for the other realm, like you would call it the spiritual realm, the electromagnetic realm, the metaphysical realm. It doesn't really matter how you define it, but it's the set of all things that aren't directly observable. And consciousness would count, because it's not like you can look at a person and see their consciousness. You experience your own consciousness, yes, but it's accepted that it's something separate from your body. Even though it interacts with your body, it has an aspect of it that is not equal to your body and does survive death.
Yeah, so I did earlier this week a public study session, so to say. If people watch my channel, I've been doing these all the time, and they're kind of just, I read over scientific literature and try to find very good PowerPoints to you either read over or talk about. And I've been doing these for quite a while. So I did earlier this week on just an overview of what quantum consciousness is. I found two prominent physicists that have top theories. Penrose, the anesthesiologist. Penrose, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, I believe, and Hamerov is a anesthesiologist doctor who is on the steering committee of the annual consciousness gathering that gathers together a lot of the top experts that are proposing these theories. And there's a lot of theories, really. There's like tens of different theories, and just to understand one of them is quite complicated. So if anyone's interested, you could listen to it, or you could just see the literature in that, or the PowerPoints that I found that go over it. This conversation will probably not be technical at all, and if there is more interest, we'll have further talks that might be more technical. I thought we would. I would read Jennifer's paper, and if she wants to read it, she's welcome to read it.
Oh, thanks, David. It's okay. You can read it. Would you like me to give the definition for reincarnation before we start?
Okay, sure.
Basically, it's just the idea that the conscious entity that you experience the world with does not die when you do. When your physical body dies, the soul leaves, but it contains a residual energy inside of it. And you can think of that as your personality. And over time, that will simplify down, because the mind has an ability to observe itself. So observing and waveform collapse are the same thing in quantum mechanics. So what was originally a more complex mind will become simplified, and eventually it'll be simple enough that it's coherent with a new body. And the consciousness will localize to that new body, and that will trigger the growth of the fetus. That's the essential definition, and I'll let Duvid read the article there. Thank you very much.
Okay, so this is from Jennifer's blog, and it's somewhat of a outline of a scientific proof of reincarnation. So your first her definitions. So I put it in the chat. This is called the proof of reincarnation, part 2. So the definitions: quantum mind, the superset of subjective human consciousness, including the total animate potential to conform with the first Copenhagen interpretation principle. There can be no hidden parameters. Consciousness, the subjective stimulus experienced as selfness, the state of wakefulness as opposed to sleep. Quantum systems, a system of discrete entities that may or may not be coherent, have the potential to interfere, that obeys with the laws of quantum mechanics. Such systems transition in a stepwise manner as opposed to a continuous one. Eigenstate, particular value of a system. Sorry, once I'm actually going to screen share this so people could read along with me. Okay, introduction. We will first give a brief overview of the history of models of consciousness. Then we will discuss the extant ideological hurdles to embrace the quantum mind hypothesis before fleshing out the general structure of the mind as a quantum computer. Finally, we will demonstrate the proof of reincarnation. We hope that these findings will serve to properly contextualize the tenets of both religion and science, as well as renew mainstream interest in the eternal questions of origins, existence, and transcendence. History. Throughout the ages, the concept of reincarnation or rebirth, the soul returning to the flesh realm after the event of death, has figured into religious beliefs to various extents. While reincarnation has been explained in numerous ways by various authorities, the scientific community has largely failed to accept the concept thus far. In more recent times, however, several scholars have put forth theories that consciousness has its origins in quantum mechanics. Proponents of quantum mind hypothesis include the anesthesiologist Dr. Stuart Hameroff, physicist Dr. Roger Penrose, and Dr. David Bohm, among others. Though they've made progress, these models have thus far failed to satisfactorily solve the so-called hard problem of consciousness. Ideological hurdles. The doctrine of reincarnation contradicts several views in institutional religion and science. Modern science posits that quantum mechanical systems cannot exist on the macro scale. The correspondence principle, and a widely circulated theory that quantum coherence on the scale of the mind is impossible because it is too warm, wet, and noisy. However, we reject both of these ideas on the basis that there is no evidence that coherent quantum systems cannot manifest on the macro scale. Belief to the contrary is consequent to a fundamental misunderstanding of quantum fields, leading to a failure to bridge the gap for quantum systems more complex than a few waveforms. The quantum computer hypothesis, we argue that consciousness can most accurately be described as a computer that is essentially quantum in nature. Consciousness as a computer. Consciousness must be a computer for an entity that performs computations. These computations fall into one of three general categories: thoughts, emotions, sensations, and register to the subjective consciousness, a subset of the total quantum mind. Thus, we can affirm that since the consciousness essentially performs the function of computation, it is a computer. Consciousness is a quantum system. Modern science categorizes systems as either classical, able to be modeled by finite shapes, or quantum, able to be modeled with a statistical distribution. Since there's no third option, it follows that consciousness is either physical or quantum in essence. The consciousness of a physical computer hypothesis has been refuted on several occasions and can be satisfactorily disproven by the existence of fields emanating from the quantum mind that are measurable. Thus, by process of elimination and by virtue of measurable states emanating from the consciousness, it must be quantum in nature. Thus, we have solved the hard problem of consciousness. That is, we have established the fundamental nature of consciousness as a quantum computer. We have not given a physical model of the quantum mind and if the computational limitations of the Schrodinger wave equation are any indication, such a solution may be precluded by universal computational limitations. However, if the measurement device can be calibrated so as to enable progressive recursion, we may be able to isolate particular attributes of the quantum mind at a later time. This computational limitation does not preclude the utility of the hypothesis, as a great deal of verifiable predictions can still be made. This is because all quantum systems abide by the laws of conservation, entropy, and general wave mechanics, and these are positive formulations, equations linking state variables, giving information. So proof of reincarnation. Given that consciousness is a quantum computer, its waveform can be modeled as a tensor comprising the set of all sets of mapped stimuli, which we call eigenstates. Within the subjective consciousness, a subset of all the total quantum mind, we posit that there exist no constructs outside of the set, thoughts, emotions, sensations, and that all constructs that appear to be distinct from these are but linear combinations of these three basis vectors. We make this assertion because no other constructs can be satisfactorily argued to exist independently of the aforementioned three states of consciousness. We posit that the tensor must have some ability to reduce itself, for this is the origin of thoughts. Thoughts are those experiences that emanate from the same direction they are absorbed, and so the quantum mind must have the capacity to reduce itself, namely by thinking. We also posit that there must exist some residual aspect of the quantum mind that is not subject to state reduction. It is that which reduces the subjective consciousness and all other potentials, that which causes the heart to beat, the stomach to contract, and so forth, as there is nothing to reduce them aside from the physical body itself. Thus, in the absence of a functioning physical body, there exists no mechanism to reduce these potentials. Thus, upon the event of physical death, the remaining quantum mind proceeds to reduce its eigenstates until it can no longer reduce any eigenstate. At this point, it will remain a potential unit. It interacts with some measurement device capable of further reducing its eigenstates. At such a time, the potential is sucked into the cortex of the newly formed fetus before it begins to pump consciousness again. The pump action consists of the potential field reducing to the photocortex and the photocortex proceeding to project the quantum mind. This localize is the consciousness to the flesh and sets up a seesaw of energy between flesh and quantum mind for the remainder of that lifetime. The first sign of transmutation of potential consciousness to living consciousness is the heartbeat, usually detectable about the 5-week mark. Why does the quantum mind spontaneously reduce? Since all forms are subject to the laws of entropy, that the total energy of a system will spontaneously progress towards a state where all differentials are minimized, the quantum mind will always seek a greater entropy state until no such state exists. When this occurs, we consider the system to be in a zero-point energy. The zero-point energy is the lowest energy quantum state possessing a non-zero energy. For example, the electron has a non-zero energy that does not spontaneously reduce itself, and so does a zero-point energy. It maintains a potential field and does not spontaneously reconfigure to another state because no such state exists. Above zero-point energy, the reduction of a waveform is energetically favored. The mind, being a complex biological energetic configuration, cannot be a zero-point energy, and so will always reduce when it is structurally possible to do so. By Copenhagen Interpretation Principle 3, in order to reduce, the quantum mind must interfere with a suitable measurement device. Once the mind can no longer interfere with itself, it can only interfere with living flesh. This living flesh must be maximally coherent with the quantum mind, and so the mind is attracted to a body possessing characteristics of the residual mind, and we have proven reincarnation. Okay. Jennifer?
Thanks for that. That was very, very nice to hear it. So I don't know how self-evident that is, but that was the way that I thought I could explain how that happens. So I guess we can continue on with whatever direction you'd like to go on in the discussion.
Yeah, I think it's quite a stretch to, so to say, prove reincarnation, because there's so many factors that have to be taken into account. And we could discuss the current theories, such as the Hameroff-Penrose model, or the different models, and whether they actually support your theory or not. obviously these things are pretty complicated, like eigenstates. Unless people have taken differential equations, they may not be familiar with eigenstates, and a lot of it's pretty esoteric. And I don't know if you want to try to give an explanation for the quantum mind. Obviously, I did my public study session, and I could give the history of. I could give a more general understanding that's less based on quantum physics that might fit in with spiritualist, unless you have something you want to add.
Well, I could talk a little bit about the eigenstates and how that can be related to consciousness.
Okay, so I'll just say first that when I did my study session, my general conclusion was that thought in what we call consciousness does not arise from the brain, that it arises from some spiritual element, and the brain basically controls sensation, motor control, possibly emotion and memory and different things. But beyond that, the scientists were not going to find thought or consciousness from the physical form. However, the concept that there's some interface between the spiritual realm where the soul exists and the material realm, historically people believe that that was the pineal gland, because I guess it becomes very solid and doesn't decay or in small, or the location. But even the Hebrew Vedic sources till Descartes and even modern day spiritualists, a lot of people claim that that interface is the pineal gland. But with the advent of quantum physics in these collapsed states or quantum entanglement, and specifically what Hameroff added was these filaments within the protein. These like completely cylindrical filaments could be venues for these quantum states to enter and be some sort of interface between the spiritual and physical realm. And that's not exactly what the science is saying. So the science is more mechanical and mechanistic, and I'm more spiritual. So my view would be more interface, and quantum mechanics is the method of interfacing between the spiritual and the material. But I understand, Jennifer, you're more, so to say, a pure materialist.
I wouldn't call myself a materialist. I'm more of the opinion that a lot of people simply won't be convinced by an argument that's rooted in religion. I mean, I kind of wish that weren't the case, but I've just known too many atheists to think differently. So instead of relying on religious arguments, I try to bring it back to scientifically solid ideas.
We separate. You seem to have two separate venues where you're, so to say, a preacher of reincarnation who believes the belief in reincarnation is one of the fundamental tenets that will lead to a better world. And plus, you also believe that it's true and can scientifically be shown, because obviously the science, it doesn't matter whether people believe it or not. If it's true, it's true. And the scientific theory, could be verified and tested and studied by the experts, regardless of the ability of the common people to understand it. But I mean, at the same time, you would call yourself a preacher of reincarnation to the common person, that it would benefit their life to understand these processes.
Yeah, for sure. I also understand that most people cannot be persuaded by scientific arguments either. So I try to mix it up between personal and scientific arguments, and I try to leave the religious part out of it. Just to go back to the Hameroff hypothesis a little bit, I thought it was an interesting idea, but I'm not sure that it's completely correct, because they're actually proposing a mechanism whereby the consciousness is essentially projected from these microtubules, and these are long things inside the body that have the capacity to project a quantum field. And that theory, I'm not sure if it's been validated to the point where people have accepted it, or if it's still kind of open to discussion. But
I went over a paper, some recent tests, and the interesting point of that model is that that would give consciousness to basically all life forms. And from what I understand, even people like Freeman Dyson have claimed that consciousness exists in inanimate materials, and even the atom itself would exhibit some amount of consciousness, as where Hamarov is saying anything that has these microtubules is a conduit to be able to pick up upon these quantum fields. And there's actually been tests on plants that I forget the name of the model, but I read it in my study session of like the 19 different points of what are called consciousness, that even simple plants might display 2 of them. And you could even scientifically test that by doing like EEG measurements on plants. And so there is some sort of evidence that plants do exhibit some sort of attentional force that could tap into nature and cause it to like grow in a certain direction or react, or the plant to function as an overall unit that may not be able to explain by simple biological processes other than this like microtubule collapsing quantum states that would cause the plant to have some sort of general consciousness that could direct the whole plant towards one purpose.
Yeah, exactly. When you want to answer questions about whether plants are conscious or whether rocks are conscious, you have to define consciousness from the outset. So I kind of try to stay away from models that claim that everything is conscious. I know there's a field model that claims that the universe is the cause of consciousness, and that means the universe is somehow conscious. I believe Dr. Hameroff described it as being proto-conscious. I think those are a bit dangerous because I think for an uninitiated person, it maybe sounds a little loopy, the idea that a rock could be conscious. So I think it's important to distinguish 2 different ideas. One idea is this is the measurement limit of the universe, that it pervades the universe. And that's the idea that for a quantum system, the act of observation and the act of state reduction. So any change to a system is a state change, usually a state reduction, but it is possible for the states to increase in energy. So that means that the most fundamental building block in the universe is the act of observation. And what they mean by observation from a quantum mechanics perspective is interference with some sort of measurement device. And that means that things like chemical reactions are defined as observations because the electrons from one chemical are observing the electrons from another chemical and rearranging in the process. Now, to call that conscious, I think is a bit of a stretch. Like, I don't know what you want to call that, but that would be where you get those sort of loopy panpsychic theories where it implies that even, a lamp is conscious, which is, I think to most people that's a bit absurd. And the other side of it is, at what point do we define a sort of a self-consciousness? Because if I was going to look at a plant, because it doesn't have a central nervous system, its consciousness wouldn't be localized. So what we experience as ourself, that's localized because it feels like it's coming from somewhere. It doesn't feel like it's coming from your big toe. It doesn't feel like it's coming from your belly button. It has a very distinct feeling of emanating from somewhere in your brain. So self-consciousness is, I would say, like a more advanced form of this other thing, which you can call like proto-conscious or whatever. But even the most basic life form, a cell, would have some type of ability to observe things that were happening in its environs. But you don't want to jump to the conclusion of calling that conscious, because then that also may imply that other things are conscious that you probably don't consider conscious, like rocks. Like rocks have an electron matrix, but that doesn't mean that the rock sits up at night thinking about the meaning of life.
Yeah, so there's multiple theories and within the scientific field, and generally I'm a spiritualist, so a lot, even the quantum mind theories basically say consciousness is possibly a delusion, that that we're not really consciousness, saying the brain is a computer and just generates what appears to us to be consciousness, but in essence there's no such thing as consciousness. It's just some act of the material world. And but within the scientific fields, you have to look at the possibility that consciousness is not something that we personally have. It's not our own possession. It's a possession of the universe. And consciousness pervades the universe. And you could look at consciousness as kind of being like the ether, and what pervades everything, and it's just tapped into. So, of course, consciousness is in a rock, consciousness is in an atom, consciousness is everywhere, but each organism at its own level is capable of tapping into consciousness at a different level. So Hameroff is basic. Most of these people are basically evolutionists, and obviously, anyone who listens to me knows I reject evolution. I'm more of a, basically a younger biblical creationist. However, I could talk within the frames, but Hameroff, um, is a pure evolutionist, and he's looking at these different possibilities. And he had nice slides that I had shown with the historical development and when consciousness arose. So, as I said, the one theory is that consciousness predates the Big Bang and was always there, and then organisms, so to say, evolved to be able to tap into this power of consciousness. And even the first single cell organisms were designed around this. The first time that the tubule evolved, that was designed around harvesting what we call consciousness. And so when I read these papers, like, okay, we have the Penrose is a very famous physicist. Hameroff is a very respected, biologist, medical doctor. In general, no doctors, no physicists, no psychologists actually endorse these theories because they're basically theoretical. They're proposed as a scientific theory. They can be tested, but generally they're based on the future developments of science, and like collapsing, all the quantum physics that Jennifer's talking about. Um, a lot of that's still theory. It's questionable what man is able to notice. So we say, like, this is what the limit of what humans could observe when we look into these very small particles, and based on the limits of what we could see, we could speculate about what's how it's working below these microscopical units that we're able to observe at. And within what's observable, we're kind of theoretically postulating how these things work. So hence, quantum physics leaves a lot of room for spiritualism, because someone like me could say, well, obviously that's God, that's the soul, that's these spiritual forces that are at play, that to us it seems like random and we can't figure it out. You mentioned the Copenhagen and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and it's very clear that we're not going to be able to figure it out, that even if it's mechanical, it's beyond our ability to determine the mechanics of it. However, is it a mechanical solution, or is saying that's how far that man could reach in his understanding, and beyond that, there's these spiritual realms, and at most we could show that the spiritual realms are interacting with the material.
Yeah, you put a lot of good information out there. I think what you mentioned about the idea of rejecting or accepting a quantum mind type hypothesis, at the end of the day, it comes down to a difference in philosophy. There's been a lot of resistance towards accepting any type of quantum mind formulation, because people are trained to understand the mind as a physical computer, not a quantum computer. So they don't want to have to learn something new. I think for a lot of people, quantum physics is it's something they feel they have no capacity whatsoever to understand, and that's unfortunate. So they're basically proffering an impossible standard of evidence. They're saying, well, we can't accept the quantum mind hypothesis until you solve the wave equation, basically, which means you have to solve for an exact solution, i.e. propose a mechanism that makes the proper predictions and make sure that it makes all predictions. So it is difficult to work under those constraints, because I don't know how you could find such a mechanism without actually going out and looking for it. And they're sort of deciding ad hoc that there's nothing to find, so we're not going to look for it. But really what people should be doing is, from the beginning, saying, does it make more sense to describe this as a quantum system or as a physical classical mechanical type system. And unfortunately, what we've had for the most part of the development of this field is just the original, the operand hypothesis is that it's a physical computer. And there's been a lot of resistance to entertaining the opposite hypothesis. And there was even an article written that the mind or the human body was too warm, wet, and noisy to sustain a quantum system that would be able to make coherent measurements. So these...
I actually have that book, The Mathematical Universe. It was someone in the Luke Ford chat recommended that book, and I bought it and went over in my video Hameroff's response to that claim.
Well, it's funny because the physical model, the mind as a physical computer, that has the same problem, because the way we understand computers is in terms of parallel processing circuits. So how do you transform that model into the human body? Like, we don't have that same makeup. We can't isolate thoughts in the body or in the brain. It's been tried by many people and no one's ever had any success. In fact, a lot of people have said that the origin of consciousness can't possibly be in the body, just based on their own research. So hopefully we can, at the very least, make people accept the quantum hypothesis as the default hypothesis, i.e. the most likely to be correct hypothesis, even if they don't yet understand the full breadth of what it would take to understand the quantum mind, which, as you say, may actually be impossible to do. It may only be God that actually knows that in its entirety. But as I was mentioning to Claire on our chat yesterday, we as humans can't really necessarily transcend God. We can observe God and we can begin to understand certain aspects about that fundamental essence of the universe, but there may be something about being a human being that precludes us fully solving all those questions. But I don't really think you need to have that level of precision to make predictions, because I don't have an actual model like Penrose does, but my model still works for psychology because it would apply no matter where the consciousness was emanating from, because it would still be subject to the same laws no matter where it came from.
Yeah, so quantum computers are a fact, and I mean, if people want to look into the research of it, a regular computer just using a binary system is limited. This concept of entanglement, where you have like two different particles that go out, or quanta of whatever source that go out, and then if one of them changes, it affects the other one even at a distance. And your quantum entanglement is extremely complicated. I mean, you can understand it at a simple level what's going on, and so this produces exponentially more possibilities for processing power than a simple computer, but it's still basically basic computation. A quantum computer isn't different in substance necessarily from what's happening in a regular material computer, except it's exponentially more possibilities and hence giving more processing power. So if you look at the brain as a quantum computer, it doesn't necessarily mean anything spiritual. It's just explaining how there's more going on that we understand at like even the electromagnetic pulse level, that there's quantum effects that are happening in the brain and that could play a role in consciousness. So from a pure, mechanistic, there are completely mechanistic approaches to the quantum mind, and it's just saying that there's an extra layer of processing power at the quantum level, as opposed to the more spiritual approaches are looking at the quantum world in this concept of, entanglement, which involves very complicated things that aren't even understood by quantum mechanics, like gravity and the multiple dimensional universe and different things that in reality physicists don't have answers for yet today. Gravity has not been unified with the other theories, and it's unclear how these things work. But beyond, simply quantum mind explaining how the brain is more powerful than the material mechanism appears to be. But to spiritualists, it leaves a room for how, so to say, the spiritual world communicates with the material world, that there's, the collapsing of these states and particles going on that science can't measure, can't know. And so for the spiritualist, it just seems like, this is just how God communicates with the material realm. It took us thousands of years, and we finally came up with it. But we've also concluded that we can't really get much answers besides this. And unless you want to add something to that, maybe we could talk more about what is reincarnation, what's happening in reincarnation, and how that relates to these quantum theories.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention something as regards to what you said about how the mind functions as in a similar way as a physical computer, because it's a computer and it's a general class of entities. Computers are just a general class of entities that perform computations. So I would say that in essence, the mind is a computer, but in function, a quantum computer functions significantly differently than a physical computer, because it has one entangled entity in which all the information is stored, and what you experience as thoughts, emotions, and sensations are reduction values of that larger quantum system. So someone in the chat, Nation of No One, said minds aren't computers in a literal sense. They are actually computers in a literal sense, because they're computing your environment. They're making a measurement base derived from the environment, and they're feeding you something from the environment that the body has measured, and therefore the mind is a computer. It's just a little bit new to think of thoughts as being computations, but that is what they are. It's your take on something that's happened, and it may not be a logical computation, but it is a computation nonetheless. It's just a technical way of looking at what's happening.
Well, I didn't discuss this in my study session, the holographic theory, which of consciousness, which would be that within the quantum world, there's, so to say, like a hologram, which would be like a different dimensional thing that we call consciousness, and that's our awareness of our mechanism that, so to say, is projected into some different dimension. And like a hologram, where you can imagine a three-dimensional hologram that is projected to show an image, but this would be different dimensional hologram that our brain body projects, or even possibly vegetables or the world projects. And going back to like Descartes and the theater of the mind, where you have your mind consciousness, so there's one thing on stage at a time, and that's the current projection. And within that, what I mentioned, is consciousness something unique of our own person, where we each have our own consciousness, or is conscious this universal thing that we tap into? And like, could it be like moving, hovering spirits, that there's spirits hovering around, and when they come in contact with our body could project these things that, so to say, exist separate than our normal known three-dimensional mechanical world, but our quantum mind is capable of projecting these forces and spirits. And this is an interesting, related to these concepts of the quantum mind, is that the holographic theory of consciousness is very popular. It's hard to prove, it's even hard to describe, but with spiritualism, it really goes extremely nicely with concepts of like reincarnation, concepts of spirits, even concepts like exorcisms and visions and prophecies. So all these things that religions, if you want to say, kind of explain away. So scientists generally who are writing scientific papers are basically explaining away these things that thousands of years human beings postulated to be these spiritual forces. How now, however, there's an explanation for it. But I'm going to be more of the approach that it's just complementing each other, and now we could just understand these phenomenon better.
Yeah, I like your description of the hologram. I think that you can describe the consciousness that way. If you've ever looked into the idea of auras, that's more or less what it would look like. It would sort of be a field that exists near or around the body. And it's this field that's responsible for experiencing the various stimuli that the body experiences. So you mentioned a lot of things, talking about extra, like ghost type entities, as well as understanding the nature of consciousness. I think if people start by understanding the actual nature of their consciousness, I'm seeing some resistance in the chat. The comparison with computers are man-made. Well, I don't know why that's offensive. That man was able to make a computer, I think would be something that you should be proud of. And I don't think it's dehumanizing in any way to assert that the mind performs computations, i.e., it's a computer. That doesn't take away from the fact that you do have a soul, and that this soul is something that exists outside of the material realm. It's just a different way of looking at it, and we're doing that for the purpose of making people understand, who don't see the world the same way we do, why our worldview is so helpful. Religious ideas are often too abstract to convey in a way that actually convinces people. People get on the defensive, they get spooked, they have various superstitions. So what I'm suggesting is that we go and find the root of these superstitions, the root of these mental impulses that arise spontaneously in people from time to time, and using that as a tool, we can move past what scares us about consciousness, because I think it is pretty scary, the idea of dying but not really dying. I think that is pretty scary. And also the idea that ghosts can exist is a pretty spooky idea. But when you understand how quantum consciousness works, you realize that there must exist many, many, many different types of ghosts, because not all consciousness that's died has reincarnated.
I like to give a different example of. Actually, I heard from my rabbi when I was younger, who gave actually, who wasn't a scientist, but used the example of signal and receiver, where okay, me and you are having a conversation and both have computers set up. However, these signals are being broadcasted, and so the conversation that we're having exists in the world in these signals that the computer has translated our communication, through Fourier transform and different methods into signals of light or electric signals or wave compressions, and they could go out through a satellite if they go through a cord. But if it's going out digitally, that means it's out there in the universe. And if you have a computer with internet speed and that could reverse the Fourier transforms and process the data, then you could make sense of a signal that actually exists everywhere in the universe. So it's saying consciousness isn't necessarily a product of the mind. The mind is just a receiver that could process and tap into consciousness, and whatever level that someone taps into, simply the level of receiving information about what's in the immediate world and vision and sound and the senses. But there's also much deeper signals that could be explained physically through like entanglement, that hopefully we'll get into more, but saying that karma, factual elements cause these signals to be present in the world, life and death, how we live our life, how we interact with each other. All these things cause these signals to be out there. And just because we can't receive the signals doesn't mean that it's not out there. So if you're a spiritualist, is like everything you ever think, everything you ever feel, every desire your heart ever has, besides our actions and every word we say, that causes repercussion in the universe. And there's some sort of constant time record. It doesn't disappear. So if person X at some person point in time has certain thought, that is a permanent state in the universe that's recorded. and could be out there, and it's just a different vessel, the brain or the body to receive that. And then we could get into like what is the soul, and what happens during reincarnation. So classically, religiously, when we usually think about reincarnation in terms of morals, in Jewish Kabbalistic literature, for example, the common example is like repaying a debt, where God forbid, if you owe someone money and you die without repaying them, then you have to be reincarnated to pay the debt back. And God forbid, that they say you should forgive debt, because if you're owed money and die with someone owing you money, you could be brought back again in order to get that payment back. Or classical, like Hindu theology, maybe God forbid someone eats a cow, and then they have to be reincarnated as a cow to go through the same process of being slaughtered and eaten by someone else. And then is it like a localized thing where God in his infinite wisdom looks at the sum total of the karma of a person's whole life and makes some determination, the soul just goes there? Or is it delocalized after death, where the built up karma that one person did, so to say, delocalizes? So part of my karma that owes that person $5, God forbid, has to be reincarnated to pay back that part of that karma. The part of my karma that ate all those animals has to go back, and so on and so on. I'm not sure if I'm a pretty systematic thinker. I don't know if you've thought about reincarnation in a systematic way like that.
Yeah, I've definitely thought about the different options, and I think it is important, once people accept the quantum mind hypothesis, to actually go through and compare these different ways of looking at things, because both of the pictures that you paint about what's possible as regards karmatic reincarnation, those two worldviews are both acceptable under the quantum mind hypothesis. So when you work within a quantum mind hypothesis, a very general, very, very general way of looking at things.
I'll let you continue, but I'm going to press you about how good and bad, because classically most people believe in reincarnation as a form of rectifying good and bad, and how a mechanistic mind as a computer system is going to factor in these good and bad aspects, as opposed to just pure material calculations.
Yeah, the idea that you have a sort of a list of good deeds that you've done and a list of bad deeds that you've done, and somebody kind of goes through those and then punishes you part and parcel proportionally to all your sins. That's more of a physical computer model. The way I would more tend to describe it would be along the lines of desire. And you can think of desire as having a magnetic quality to it. So if you're talking about quantum mind, its nature is electromagnetic, and it's subject to magnetic laws. So you could think of like having a literal magnetism towards like your favorite food or whatever it is that you really love or are super attached to. That is the force with which you reincarnate. But the trick of it is that some of your desires are subconscious. So if you, like you say, if you eat a lot of meat and it was slaughtered in a cruel way, you may have some effect on your subconscious from that. Like some people will report nightmares after eating chicken. Let's say if they've been vegetarian for a long time and they eat some chicken, they find sometimes they get nightmares. So the way to look at that is the kind of like a residual fear in the chicken flesh that got absorbed and projected by your own quantum mind. So I think it's more like that. Like if you lead a life where you're always reaching towards knowledge and you're always improving your knowledge and you're purifying yourself, then that's the future life that you're also going to be drawn to, is a person who can have a similar kind of life as what you had previously. And it's more of a being punished by your own sins, I think, fundamentally, because you are more or less the one who's controlling your future incarnation. And that comes from things like identity. If someone firmly believes take your pick of ideological affiliation, then there's a very good chance they'll be reincarnated as somebody of the same ideological affiliation, because that there was such a strong desire in their soul to have that affiliation that they would be attracted to a life that would manifest that particular desire. And that's where you actually can get into some interesting ideas about telling the future, because there is some ability to see into the future when you're not alive. And that's because the dimension of time, when you're alive, you experience localized time. You have like the 1 day cycle. Everyone experiences that the same way. The single revolution of the earth, the revolution of the earth around the sun. We live in a manifold time interval, but it's a localized time interval. When you're dead, your consciousness is no longer localized to your body. So there's this what they call an unfolding of the time aspect, which allows you to see to some extent what the future will look like for you. And then you're just kind of choosing which one is the most like you. It's like looking for yourself in a store filled with future lives. And the people who are better at it will get the better future lives. And it's all just a matter really of how much awareness you have of what's going on, the ability with which you can handpick future lives.
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty interesting. And so Hasidic Jews, we have a lot of stories about, basically karma, and some of them appear over lifetimes or within a lifetime, where basically you do a good deed and it comes back to reward you. You do a bad deed, like the man who gives a coin to the homeless person and then finds a treasure, or so and so on that. The statement, if I did on my channel, The Ethics of the Father, every time you do a good deed, it creates a good angel that testifies on our behalf. And every time we do a bad deed, it creates a negative angel that testifies against us. And there's all types of these karmatic maxims of rabbinic lore, any tradition, that are more moralistic. But within possibly this concept of entanglement, you could give a material explanation for, so if you have person X who passes a person in time of need, and the person either decides to take themselves and help the person, or maybe to be cruel and harm the person, that would cause some sort of entanglement that wouldn't go away, and could be, so to say, unlocked in a different scenario where you have this system for karma, where the basic Judeo system or Hindu system, that that there's a storehouse, like Santa Claus is making his list and checking it twice, and every good deed we ever did is there, every bad deed we ever did there, and there's some sort of grand calculation. And so in reincarnation, that's why it could be a calculation like that a person just has to make an estimation and get the best reincarnation for their general karma. And Hinduism has a very systemized way, because Hindus have been discussing these issues for thousands of years, and there's schools of thought similar in the West where you sort of say God is karma, God is basically the laws of nature, or the more personal views that most Jews, a lot of Hindus, Christians who believe in a God is beyond nature, that even though a person may have their collection of good and bad deeds, that somehow you could repent, you could love God, you could believe in God, and that would affect a greater karmatic decision where maybe a person's got a lot of bad karma and they got a decent amount of a lot of good karma, but they have a decent amount of bad karma, but somehow God could, so to say, just untangle that entanglement that the bad karma caused. So, it's pretty interesting to think about this from a moralistic perspective, to say entanglement could be the method of how morals factors into the universe. Because, one of the biggest arguments against atheism in the mechanical universe is, well, what does life and death matter? If it's all mechanical, who cares about life and death? Who cares about good and bad? What does it matter to, besides possibly a utilitarian argument that we have to live according to those standards? to have a productive society, even though on the personal level, yes, you can break the rules and get away with it if no one sees it. So unless you have some sort of karmatic entanglement argument, you're saying, no, you cannot sin and get away with it, even if no one sees it, even if you don't get punished by your fellow man, you cause some sort of entanglement that will follow you around forever.
Yeah, I think you brought up a lot of really good points. And I think one thing to remember is that there is a sort of physical limit on the things that happen. So while quantum mechanics is essentially a statistical distribution, there's a finite number of living humans. So that means there's a physical limit to how many entities can be incarnated as humans at any given time. And that's one way to understand it. Another one is going back a little bit to the statistical model, and a lot of people get turned off by statistics. They don't like the idea of things being non-localized. They want fast and hard answers, but quantum mechanics just doesn't work that way. So the way to understand bad deeds and good deeds from a statistical perspective is that if you do something bad to someone else, then the probability of something bad happening to you in the future increases. So it may not happen right away, but as it builds up, you're increasing the probability that something bad will happen. And in the case of, let's say, somebody having a lot of negative energy directed at them for bad acts that they did or for perceived bad acts that they did, that can have an effect for sure, because everybody has some psychic energy that they can use. And if you're thinking about someone else in a way that is entanglement, it's a very loose entanglement, but it's still directing your mental focus towards another person. And if you're saying, oh, well, I really hope something bad happens to that person because I hate them for these reasons, and it may catch up to the person that you're directing it at, but it may also catch up to you because your future is determined by your present desires. So if your desire is for revenge, or if your desire is something nefarious, then that will eventually become internalized in progressively deeper levels of your consciousness. So I think that lends itself pretty easily to a moral interpretation of it, where you can say, like, people who are very miserable day to day are less capable of becoming happy again because they're kind of stuck in that mode. There's a certain, it's called inertia in physics, which is the tendency for systems to remain as they are and not change. And the way to look at that from an entropy perspective is that whatever state you're in, you're going to remain in that state until you put energy into changing it. And then you'll put energy in for a while, and then the system will sort of rev up and get more and more energy circulating in it. And then one day it'll just pop up to a higher level of consciousness. And that's a hard thing for people to understand, is this idea of instantaneous state transition, because day-to-day life, that never happens. It's not like you just get in your car and you turn on and then you're magically transported to your destination. You have to take a you have to take a line that is an uninterrupted line to your destination, whereas quantum mechanics doesn't actually function that way. So people will often every time actually work towards enlightenment for a really long time, and you won't actually get much results for whatever amount of time it takes to fully. It's not about negating your consciousness. It's about transcending all the things in you that drive you to do the things that you do. Understanding and accepting who you are as a person. And then when you get to that state where you fully transcended, you then transition to a higher state where that lower state of consciousness, you're not as focused in that lower state. You're focused now in a higher state. And once you're there, it's easy to remain there because it also has an inertia. So every state has this intrinsic tendency to remain as it is rather than change. And I noticed, I just want to comment, if I could, quickly on something Claire said. She said that Jennifer believes in God and all desire suffering. And I guess that seems like a somewhat morbid take on it, and it's kind of maybe painting people as having some sort of inbuilt evil to them. I think there is truth to the idea that living has an element of suffering to it, because your main purpose by being alive is to survive. And if everything feels good, like if being eaten by a lion feels good, then you're probably going to die. So it follows that most things probably aren't going to feel very good because your body is essentially focused on surviving, not on feeling good all the time.
Yeah, well,
Go ahead.
I'm somewhat a proponent of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And generally, I'm a seeker of truth and try to align myself with truth and recognize our limited ability to decipher the truth. And I look for truth in all ways, traditions and science and elders and trial and error and empiricism and all of the above. And certain things, so as I believe, I subscribe to, that may be more or less true, so to say, okay, so I subscribe to the nation of America, to the English language, to certain protocols of interaction. I subscribe to Judaism, certain schools of thought or belief system that I work with. However, generally, I try to submit myself to the truth and align with the truth, and the truth is a continual process that I'm trying to discover. And your point you were making, a lot of Hindus will mention the state of consciousness at the time of death is the biggest determinant factor of the next life, and that you see the different levels. So, if the person, God forbid, at the time of death is thinking more digestive and just enjoyment of pleasures or something, they might take a lower life form, be reborn as an animal or something. But it's really the fulfillment of the own person's desire um, in connection. So there's different schools that are more that desire is the determinant factor versus some exact form of calculation. The Judeo system is more that it's an exact calculation of good and bad deeds. The Hindu systems might have a desire, although both have elements of those. So I was thinking it might be interesting to try to analyze a given scenario. Like, let's say, God forbid, like a classical reincarnation example, person X, God forbid, kills person Y, and person X goes on, so to say, lives their life, and then eventually dies. And maybe in their lifetime, they didn't get retribution for their bad deed. So person Y will get reincarnated into future person A and the other person X, so to say that the karma will be balanced and the person who killed will be reincarnated and be the killer, and the person who killed will be reincarnated and be the one who was killed. But somehow that with divine wisdom, that everything is balanced into equation. That somehow God is capable of doing this, as opposed to a more physics example would be there's action reaction, there's karma, and it's so just the state. So whatever the body carries, and hopefully we could talk about this more and try to flush out, what's actually carried with the person, or is it localized to the area, where maybe the site where this horrible thing happened carries a certain amount of entanglement. Plus, there's the entanglement that goes with the persons who are participating in the act, even though they geographically move to a different place. Um, but so at the time of death, that this entanglement needs a new housing, resting space, and so it's basically just like it's basically just a conservation of energy. So the person dies, this energy is, so to say, released into the greater cosmos. And reincarnation is just it trying to find a state to re-enter and find balance.
Yeah, I think a lot of the ideas you bring up are very interesting. Specifically, to comment on the idea that your state of mind when you die is the most important factor in predicting your next life. I don't think I agree with that. Whether it's true that there's kind of this tallying of good and bad deeds is a bit more difficult to unpack, because the nature of your quantum mind is informed by your beliefs. So if you believe that that's true, so for example, if you did a bunch of good deeds and you're feeling really great about those good deeds, and that has given you the faith that those good deeds will be rewarded, they will be, whether or not there was an actual mechanism to make that happen. Just the fact that you believed in it, in the same way, if you believe you're a great sinner and that you deserve to suffer, that impulse in the mind that fuels the belief in your value, that's very strong in determining the future. If you want to actually find the true answer, you have to find the answer that is called the maximum entropy state. So it's the configuration of variables that has the lowest energy to explain and makes the most predictions. And I would say that the entity that bears the largest impact on your future incarnations, because I don't think you can just simplify it down to one thing, but I do think the majority shareholder is your personality. So if you think of your personality kind of like as a very complex painting, a very complex array of different things and encompassing everything that there is about you, the nature of that and the purity of that is that's what's residual when you die and your mind collapses itself, because it thinks away all of its thoughts. So when you're at the 0 point energy relative to being alive, so the lowest non-living energy state, right about to take birth again, there are no more thoughts left because you've thought them all. But there is that which thinks, which is, I would say, you could argue, is the personality. That's probably the biggest effect, but it does depend on the capacity that people have psychically. Like if somebody who's 1,000 times more powerful than you are decides that XYZ is going to happen to you, you don't really have the power to resist their desire. So it really does depend on the individual, because different people have different psychic power.
Well, saying that if there's a galactic karma, so to say, that people's power, people are representations of larger forces of karma. And I talk about that a lot when I talk politics or religion and theology, that I believe in greater forces, and people are just symbolic of these greater forces. So no person intrinsically has power. It's these greater forces that have power, although a given person could be a vehicle to administer a certain power. A person could, so to say, serve and surrender to that power. And if you're a monotheist, so to say, if you serve and surrender the one true power that permeates everything, that that's the path to go. And if you want to like I do a lot of systematic interfaith, where I sit down, different people, and they, we talk about our beliefs, and then we try to compare them. And I know I listen to your conversations with Claire, so you have your basic possibilities that God forbid we're completely material, and whatever we call consciousness or not doesn't matter. It leaves us at death. There's a complete termination. That's it. So to say, drink and marry for tomorrow we die, and then we just go to sleep forever, and it's like we never existed. Or that there's some separate element that survives death, and that separate element, according to Christian Christian tradition, generally is thought to go to the spiritual world and will either permanently possibly reside in heaven or hell. And so it's a one-time thing where there is a spiritual element related to a person, and after death it's just judged, and it doesn't return to the material world, and either goes to a negative outcome of hell or a positive outcome of the spiritual world. Or even within Hinduism, where you have these different worlds. So, I mean, if you're like Spinoza and you just think the universe is all there is, there's not a separate spiritual world. And so at the time of death, the soul can't, like in Hindu realms, return to like Loka or different spiritual realms. It has to immediately find another resting vehicle to contain that energy. So reincarnation has to be something that instantaneously occurs the second of death. So, it has to be that one one person died and another vehicle of birth is looking for to harvest that soul? Or is it possible the soul could kind of just like hover around? And if you're looking at these states of entanglement, that you could have a delocalized state of entanglement that might wait for a period of minutes, hours, or even hundreds, thousands of years before it re-enters a specific being? Or is it delocalized where you're in Hebrew they call it like the Yom Hishtalkis. When a person dies, there's like the collective gathering of everything they did in their whole life, and that becomes like a singular force. So there's like, okay, there's Duvid, there's Jennifer, there's whoever, but there's a collective spiritual force of the sum total of your life till death, and that survives your death. And that could either maintain with your body, and you might pray at the graves of deceased people and believe resurrection of the dead or whatever belief, or that essence left your body. And so these are interesting takes. If you want to get into reincarnation, then maybe also we could discuss, is it likely that it's so to say racial or lineage based? The most likely place for a soul to go is to the child of the person, and or is it completely haphazard where you have souls like European going to India and India going to Europeans? Is that the exception? Is that the rule?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't think it's possible to die and reincarnate instantly, because I think there is probably a fairly long time interval where the mind is decaying. So going through all the thoughts like that you have, thinking all your thoughts, and then losing those thoughts and losing all the attributes
Like
of
if
the
the person
person.
goes through burial, but I say, what if the person gets cremated instantly?
Oh, that wouldn't actually affect it, because the soul, the quantum soul, leaves the physical body on the event of death, because there's nothing holding it there anymore. So the instant that your heart stops, your consciousness, in all probability, what happens is that it starts to get really big. And that's because there's no energy force to localize it. So the body does work, a tremendous amount of work. The body consumes a tremendous amount of energy to localize the consciousness. And based on entropy, a localized state is not usually energetically favored. Usually what's favored is things spreading out. That's how entropy dictates the evolution of systems. You can look into Brownian motion, which is dissolved solutes slowly moving from the origin point. So I'm guessing that it gets quite large, and when it gets to the point where it can't get any bigger, it starts to kind of decay a little bit, and over time decays more and more. And when it decays to the point that it's coherent with a fetus, because a fetus is significantly less complex than a human. If the coherence event is happening at 5 weeks, as I've predicted based on the heartbeat being detectable at 5 weeks, then you have to basically wait till everything is simple enough to match with a tiny little fetus. So that would require a fair amount of waveform collapse before it could happen. And as regards the different lokas and realms, layers, however people want to look at them, I haven't gone into that too much, because I'm primarily coming from a scientific perspective, because although I'm deeply religious myself, I don't expect to really convince people coming from a religious perspective. And when you get into more abstract ideas like lokas or different domains where the soul can go and be there for a while and leave, that's something that's very speculative. I don't know how you would establish beyond a shadow of a doubt that these places exist. And so I'm more thinking of it in those terms. Like if someone is an atheist, they already don't believe me about what I'm saying. So I have to work on changing their minds so that later on maybe these concepts will make more sense. So, because if everybody already accepted the basic tenets of the hypothesis, it would make a lot more sense to talk about layers, lokas, etc., because it would be maybe proportional to someone's state of mind. Like if somebody is in a really terrible state of mind and every day is constant suffering and there's no hope, that state doesn't have any coherence with a person who's in a very hopeful and happy state of mind. So it stands to reason that those regions that they would be occupying, which are energetic regions, would not be the same region because they have no qualities in common.
Well, so walk us through the process of how would a single reincarnation take place? That you have a death at some point and the delocalization of the consciousness or soul, however you want to refer to it, and then you would have a new fetus that would be at the opportune time to take that soul. But you walk us through that process. How would that work according to your conception?
Well, when you die, you're still localized and you're still having thoughts and feelings, and your consciousness may not be quite as bright as when you were in your prime, like you're probably kind of more feeble and things like that. And when the consciousness leaves the body and the heart stops beating and the body is no longer alive, there's no way for the consciousness to interface with the body any longer. And because it was a magnetic interface in the first place, because it's an electromagnetic field, so it has a magnetic component to it. And as we know, magnets can be attractive or repulsive, but they do exert forces on each other in one of those two directions. So you can think of the living body as like a magnet that localizes the consciousness. And then that magnet gets turned off because the field of the body is dead, which then causes the consciousness to sort of spring out from its magnetized state and then go into the shape that it was or would be without a body. But this entity is still capable of some form of thought and feeling, because that's what it's designed to do, is think and feel. So those thoughts and feelings, they're eigenstates of the quantum mind, and that's something that is very hard to understand if you're not initiated in math. But the way to look at it is that you have thoughts, you have emotions, and you have sensations, and there's not anything else that you have. You can argue that more complex things exist, like archetypes and other things, but you can always just say, well, those are just thoughts. They just happen to be very complex thoughts. And thinking is something the mind does. So the act of thinking is a computation, i.e. it's an observation, which means it performs a waveform reduction. So as you think a thought, you lose your ability to think that thought again, because the only thing that would allow you to think that thought again would be if your body kind of pumped it back up. That's how your body functions, is it's always pumping up your mind and giving it the capacity to experience its eigenstates. The quantum mind is the set of all sets of these eigenstates: thoughts, emotions, sensations. So I know that probably sounds overly simplistic for a lot of people, but there's no reason to overcomplicate it, and it's already complicated enough as it is. However, there's a theory in math that explains that the set of all sets is not a set. So that means that the quantum mind is not an eigenstate. It's not a thought, an emotion, or a sensation. It's something else. It's something that precipitates those eigenstates. So it's like a very complicated, entangled entity, and the things that it receives are signals from the body, and the thing that it gives out are eigenstates, thoughts, emotions, sensations. But the complicated part is that it feeds back to itself. It both emanates and receives those things. If you're thinking, you're receiving information from the entity that's thinking. So it can be very counterintuitive maybe when people are starting out. But the fact is that this stuff has never been easy to understand for anyone. It's always been esoteric. It's always been a small proportion of society that's been interested in or understood these things in the first place. So if you're new to this, just take it slow, and remember that your beliefs do, in a very large way, determine the outcome. If you have a very superstitious view of reality that will precipitate in the future. You create your future in a more fundamental way than most people realize. And Duvid asks, do these states exist within or separate from the boundaries of time? That's a very good question, and I don't actually know the answer.
Do they exist within the boundaries of space? Because to just give a single example of how a reincarnation process would exist, it would seem that after death, the whatever these elements are that are leaving the body of consciousness would just spread in all directions, as opposed to relocalize in a single element and then enter a new position. So, I mean, you could come on and say, well, in reality, the soul didn't exist within space. So when it left the body, it's not like it left the body at a certain space. It left the body and then could re-enter a different place in the cosmos. And you could even say that it's outside of time. That or so there's many different possibilities. But I'm just trying to look at it because from a like if you're thinking like kind of like the ghost form, like the spirit leaves the body when the body dies, and then the spirit is kind of like hovering around until it could find a new vessel and to park itself in whatever the process of that spirit. And that's what the Kabbalists, that's what the mystics for generations have understood reincarnation, generally through these spiritual ghost type concepts. Although within Vedic and Kabbalistic systems, there's also a very precise scientific way to understand this. But now we're looking at the quantum computing, and I really just don't see how you're understanding it. What happens when the soul leaves, and how is it possible that it doesn't just spread out and go all over the place, that it would regather and enter a new being?
Well, that all comes down to how quantum systems work and where the 0 point energy is. So it's not that easy to understand because there's kind of two boundaries. So the way to think about it is in terms of electrons. They are delocalized within a particular location, which seems contradictory, but it's not. They're spherical waveform potentials where the electron is spread out throughout that particular sphere. It's a very small sphere, but it's not a point. It's an actual volume. Now, that electron does not spontaneously diffuse out, nor does it spontaneously collapse in. And that's because that the size that it has is the maximum entropy state, aka the 0 point energy. So for all energetic or massive entities, there exists a 0 point energy, and your consciousness would also have a 0 point energy. When you're alive, it has a particular 0 point energy, and that's how far it goes from your body. Most people, when they're not very spiritually advanced, the consciousness is very close to the body and it dwells deep in the body. That they get a lot of like neurosis and things from that. As they get more advanced, the consciousness tends to move out from the body, so you're in an increasingly larger circle. And that's always the 0 point energy. It's just different 0 point energies depending on what level of spiritual attainment you're at. When you die, though, it's a little bit tricky because there's nothing holding the consciousness to the body anymore. So it kind of springs out. It's like if you had a magnet holding something, an electromagnet holding something, and all of a sudden you turned it off and it would just dropped it. And at that
it would appear the nature that it would just delocalize in all directions. So how is it possible that the spirit would gather and then re-enter at a precise location?
It would delocalize, so it was sort of like spread out, but it wouldn't just spread out arbitrarily large. Eventually it would reach its non-incarnate 0 point energy. So that's the state where it would take energy to make it bigger, but it would also take energy to make it smaller. So that's the state where it's in balance, and that size is determined by the inner electrical qualities of the system. I have no idea how big it can get. Probably depends on the person. It's definitely larger than living consciousness, and then it's very large, and then What you have to remember is that it is not able to reduce without a measurement device. That's the important thing to remember, is that the system won't change unless a measurement device interferes with it, because quantum systems do not spontaneously reduce unless there's a measurement system that is sufficiently close to them to reduce. So it would not be able to reincarnate until it was simplified enough to become coherent with a living body. So it needs to kind of go through its own processes and think through its thoughts. And in that process, it will probably get smaller, geometrically smaller. And then through magnetics, it will be drawn to a future life, an unborn fetus, when it's simple enough. Because until the time that it's simple enough, it won't be coherent with the fetus.
You're just thinking on the spot where, like the signal example, and historically, a lot of mystics talked about vibrational energy. So it's just like, okay, if I pick up my phone to make a call and we're using like a satellite, the signal might go out in all directions in a delocalized way. However, the intended receiver gets it in as one single message. And that's maybe related to the concept of entanglement, that when one particle is affected, that instantaneously collapses the particle that could be in a different location, so that even if it did go out in all different directions, so to say, that when it finds the proper vessel to receive it, that would collapse all the other states that the signal has been picked up.
Exactly. Everything would just become collapsed because you have that same magnetic attraction, because the unborn fetus has in it the magnetic backbone required to attract the soul.
But then you get back to the different theories. Is it a single soul, or is it combinations of other souls? So to say, the karma of a person in their lifetime is sending out these signals, but there's maybe infinite, millions, countless signals of all the different entanglements that a person has caused through their karma and their collective lifetime, and that different elements of that, or is it like a one-to-one straight transaction? Or can it be, is it both? In different circumstances, it works different ways.
It's a really fascinating question, and it's an extremely complicated topic, because we always have to remember that on some level, your beliefs manifest what happens to you. So if you have a certain belief that things will happen a certain way, then if it's physically possible, it will happen. And so it's really hard to dig into this idea of entanglement and whether you can have like souls mashing up into one bigger soul. I don't really think that makes sense, because I guess I don't feel like there would be room for more than one soul in one body for the most part. I don't know if you ever saw a video about these identical twins that were really, really, really identical. Like they would basically talk over each other. It's these young girls. I forget their name, but there's a video of them that was put on TV, and they say that they feel like they're the same person. So in that case, I would say that may very well be the case of a soul, one soul existing in two different bodies. I do think that's possible. And just looking at these twins, there really didn't seem to be a distinction on a soul level between them.
I was saying, a soul could be made up of multiple parts, and upon death, the soul splits up into those parts, and the new fetus receptacle for the soul doesn't just take complete soul from a different person. It reassembles parts from different souls to make a new soul.
That would in some way be a violation of the first in the list of the Copenhagen interpretation, that there can't be any hidden variables outside the quantum system, and the quantum system is all that there is. And if we're modeling the personality as a quantum system, there wouldn't be any mechanism to like mix and match personalities I'm not excluding it as a possibility, but I think the more likely explanation is that what reincarnates is a kind of a simplified version of what you were in your past life. So it's like formatting a computer. You have the same operating system, but you've lost all the files. So the idea is that you're kind of born with a personality that survived death. And that was essentially the only thing that survived death, because you basically lost all your motor functions, you lost the ability to speak, everything's gone, but there's still someone in there that has had their humors, or however you want to put it, their disposition shaped by previous events.
So I always mention, the second commandment, which doesn't specifically mention reincarnation, but you're saying God is don't worship engraven images, because God is an angry, jealous God who visits the sins of the fathers upon the children for 3 and 4 generations, but is faithful to reward the righteous for 1,000 generations. That most religious systems have this concept of the rise and fall of families and tribes and nations based on collective righteousness and sin. So that from a typical Kabbalistic attitude, when the soul enters the body, you sort of say have to sign off on 3 or 4. The second commandment mentions 3 and 4, so there's different interpretations whether that means 7 generations or it means 3 generations for certain types of karma and 4 generations for different types of karma. But either way, when the soul enters the new body, that besides the origin of the soul, they also have to accept a certain material karma of the bloodline that they've been born into.
Yeah, I think that goes to what you were talking about earlier about whether reincarnation is strictly along bloodlines or if there's some other mechanism that operates. And I think it always comes down to having to look at the solution that is the most, basically the highest entropy answer. And in the case of humans, most people don't really give too much thought to their future lives. They don't obsess about it. They just sort of live and die, and that's, they don't contemplate it much. In that case, I would say it does make sense to take birth among your descendants, because they're the ones who are going to have the more similar genetics as you. And there is a connection between the quantum mind and genetics, though they're not the same thing. The genetics are the potential to manifest various qualities, so it would make sense that you would take birth among people who had the potential to manifest the same qualities that you had inside yourself already. But of course, there's room for that to expand, because
When obviously the mother doesn't die at birth.
Sorry?
Well, obviously the mother doesn't die at birth, so so if there is some sort of, the most logical origin of the soul would be some sort of division of the mother's soul to the baby, so that we get back into the question of division of souls, or just saying, the mother, at some point the fetus is entering the soul is entering the fetus within the mother's body, that that is it back to that division of souls. Is it a single unit of entry that from the spiritual realm, this soul that may or may not have existed in the past, finds its resting state in, or there's a transfer, like what happens with the mother's soul that's right there within the same body?
Yeah, those two viewpoints, I would say, are essentially diametrically opposed. The idea that we're kind of a mashup of our parents, I think that idea comes from how people look at genetics. A lot of people want to make the argument that everything about us can be predicted by genetics, and there's nothing other than genetics. It's just genetics creating consciousness, and then consciousness creating everything else.
Well, I'm talking about a spiritual. So say obviously you have your genetic things that might determine the person's appearance or a lot of traits, but also a certain spiritual giving, that the soul being non-spiritual, not connected to the person's genetics, but that soul also coming through, so to say, bloodline, that it, has nothing, the soul's not coming through the blood. However, the spiritual destination of the soul somehow resides within bloodlines.
Okay, so the soul being a combination of the mother's soul and the father's soul. Is that kind of the idea?
Was I guess my conception, although obviously there's only one unity, but there's unity in parts, that you have this soul that is made up of multiple parts. So I mean, if you could look at it like, okay, upon birth, that part of the ancestry of all the ancestors somehow enters the person, or at least, the going back 3, 4, 7 generations, that those, not only the genetic component, but some soul spiritual component of the actual karma, because the genetic component doesn't contain the sum total of the good and bad deeds of your ancestors. That's not part of the genetics. So the spiritual component of the soul, which would contain the sum total of the good and bad deeds of your ancestors. So you have like a mixed up soul. So when you take birth, that, let's say going back 7 generations, besides the genetics, that you have some sort of combination of the karma of your ancestors going back 7 generations.
Does it feel like that? Does it feel like you're a combination of other people?
Well, I'm saying because the Bible says, from a biblical perspective, it's a given that the children suffer for the sins of the parents. So if you're saying that's not a genetic thing, when you talk about the sins of the parents being visited upon the children, we're not talking about something genetic. We're talking about a factor of good deeds and bad deeds, that if there was good and bad deeds that weren't recorded in the material world, but were recorded to the spiritual world, that those are passed on to your offspring. So to say, a
Like,
debt, you're eligible to pay off the debts of your great 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 grandfather. You may not have known all your good and bad deeds, but if your ancestors had these great deeds or these bad deeds out there, that you're the most likely vessel of that karma.
I think the way I would explain that is that because the effects of karma don't manifest instantly, it's a statistical probabilistic distribution wherein like you put in a lot of good deeds and eventually you get some really great consequence, or vice versa. And the way I would sort of marry that to the idea of hereditary reincarnation is that if you're constantly reincarnating among people who are very similar to you, which is always what happens, eventually you get the consequences of your actions. So maybe you did some evil in one lifetime, but it took 7 lifetimes of living that same evil to actually get a consequence. But you eventually got the consequence because you are your own, in a way, you're your own descendant. You were living in the past, and that person gave birth to someone who gave birth to someone else who gave birth to someone else, and eventually you took birth again along your own line. So I don't know if that's the exact same way of looking at it, but it's definitely true that the energy that you put out there and the intention you put out there, it does eventually come back to you. It just doesn't happen instantly. It can happen on God's time, basically.
That's why I seem to favor the Kabbalist view of the soul as somewhat of a sum total of parts, and the parts coming from different places than a single whole given over transfer. And if you think, like, if you want to talk biblically, where you have, what's the cause of the current state of affairs and strife between nations, it's basically the interactions of our ancestors. So like in the Bible, you might have Jacob and Esau, or Isaac and Ishmael, and so these ancient battles between brothers. Today is the battle between Islam and Judaism or Christianity, that those, Esau, Isaac and Ishmael, it went on to create these forces that are existent in large. So because our ancestors, like in East Africa, they have the teasing cousin system, where you basically small things accumulate over generations to have warring tribes. But genetically, that information, that okay, I come from this ancestor who created this tribe, and these people come from that ancestor who created that tribe, and generations ago there was this bad stuff that happened, and so that bad karma is carried out till today. That that's not genetically or material. So from a atheistic point of view, it's carried through traditions because people never forget and you have to remember. But I'm saying that there's actually a spiritual component to the karma besides for the traditions that are taught people, and there's actually like a factual karma that okay, like different people's ancestors were on different sides of the war. Or you're saying that I mean, it's possible that a Nazi could be reincarnated as a Jew, and a Jew as a Nazi, or a Hindu could come as a European, and it's some more complicated calculation that's largely beyond human grasp.
It's really funny, I think, to think of a war carrying on between two groups, life on life on life. I think that's
basically the Bible.
But I do actually think that is what's happening. It's because things have been set into motion that were never like derailed. So they just continued, and they kind of changed forms over time. And as far as whether you can have people taking birth, as you said, like crossing what would appear to be maybe a racial barrier or a cultural barrier, I really don't know. I think at the end of the day, the will trumps all. So if you have a supreme will, like if your will is indomitable, you could probably do anything that was possible. You can't take birth as something that doesn't exist because it doesn't exist. But you could probably have your pick of every single human birth, regardless of what your origin was. There may be limitations to that as well, but you have to look at the different options. Like I like to start off by saying sort of anything is possible within the quantum line hypothesis, and I'm more interested in looking at what is the most probable. And the most probable is that you're going to reincarnate among your descendants, who will presumably have some similar tradition as what you've had in the past. But if that ceases to be the case, then the probability of taking birth outside of your lines would increase, depending on several factors, because it's not just a genetic. It's not just about the harmonic of genetic. It's not just about being attracted to a particular set of genetics, because it's the mind that deforms the genetics, not the other way around. It's also about what is that life going to bring you. If you have certain needs in your life or certain desires in your life, and there's only one life that can offer that to you, well, if you have the capacity to deform your consciousness willfully to take that life, then it may be possible to do things that a lot of people would consider maybe spooky, but the psychic realm is very spooky sometimes. Is it okay if we answer some of the questions in the chat?
You take a few minutes and just...
Sure. So Asher was asking, I don't understand the significance of the heartbeat as compared to the brain being active. Have I touched on that before? I have not actually touched on that before. The reason I took the heartbeat as the instantiation of consciousness is because a lot of people were fighting about abortion, and there's really it's very hard to argue about abortion, because if you make it illegal, then people will just start having illegal abortions, and that'll be more dangerous. And you can get into different arguments about, what's actually the least harm path. So I was trying to explain to people that if you're actually looking at reducing harm past the 5-week point, which is when you have a heartbeat, there would be consciousness in the body. And the reason I'm arguing that the heart is the seat of consciousness from that perspective is that you need to have a beating heart before you have anything else. Like, it's a wave, right? It has a wave shape. It's a vibration, the heart, and all the other vibrations in the body are harmonics of that initial vibration, not the mind. Because you got to remember, the mind exists separate from the body. But when the mind is first being localized to the body, the engine by which it is made to permeate the body is the heart. So I hope that answers that question. And we have some more comments about Buddhism saying that reincarnation is parental selection at the moment of conception. So that's not just Buddhism that has ideas like that in it. There's a lot in Ayurvedic teachings that explain how the state of mind of the mother can affect the child that's born. And that does make a lot of sense, because the fetus is going to have a different vibe depending on how the mother's state of mind is. If the mother's stressed out, then those stress hormones are going to be awash on the fetus. And if the mother's very happy, then the fetus will have the serotonin and things like that. So there is an impact there. Those things are all true. It's like a confluence of factors that all stitches together to give one result. And it's important to start thinking in that way, like having multi-causal systems. Whereas if you try to simplify everything down to one single cause, you're never going to understand everything. So you have to understand that different causes can exist in different proportions, and to what extent those causes affect the result, it all depends on your own psychic power. So why does a heart transplant change consciousness? Actually, someone was mentioning to me recently that there was a heart transplant that was performed where somebody actually received the memories from, or they had memories imparted to them from the heart. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that was mentioned in it. So I'm not sure if anyone has any other questions. I know this stuff can be pretty confusing, and
it's a lifetime of study. I mean, it's like a medical doctor or something who may went through a grueling multi-year process to be able to be a doctor. But everyone has opinions on health because everyone has a body they have to take care of. So, the issue, okay, like I really find this issue interesting. You also, and saying enough that, physics, I spend my spare time, studying physics. And really, I don't have too much time to study physics. And there's other issues that are more pertinent. And people who follow my channel know I do a lot of interfaith. And, we got, God forbid, we had our, vigil after the Pittsburgh shooting. And we had all these interfaiths and all the, people come together. And there's usually so many communal issues that the clergy has to deal with, where we're talking about taking care of the poor, or world politics, immigration, just issues that are facing people at the moment. That can we actually sit together and let's talk about reincarnation. Let's not worry about any of the stuff that's on our current material realm of the stuff we have to deal with, and let's talk about reincarnation. And I've actually done that quite a bit, and reincarnation is one of my favorite issues, that when I do interfaith and have time where a person opens up and I'll ask them about their beliefs in reincarnation, and there's a lot of offshoots to it. And but I'm a scientist by nature. I love physics. My father said he's a family practice doctor. He loves reading. He buys all these books that come out on the topic and skims through them, but he doesn't have a forum of like-minded people to talk it out. So I'm really happy to have met Jennifer, and she come on to my channel, and we're talking about this. And presumably both of us spend a lot of our free time studying this. To me, this is just my passion. It is nothing at all related to what I do professionally. I'm not sure about you, if it's it's just your passion, or you have some sort of professional relation to research these subjects, or you have to dedicate your own spare time to researching this.
Yeah, it's just a personal passion project. I've had to make a lot of personal sacrifices to do this, but I feel like meeting people like you makes it worth it, because it's such a lonely life, and we have a lot of good information that we can give to people. And having a forum where the exchange of information is made possible, I think is a great service to mankind. And maybe if we can, to some extent, shift people's focus onto something more positive, it will put the negative things into perspective and make it easier to move forward. Because I really don't like to see the level of the discourse sometimes, like when you take the time to talk to people on a live stream and they're not really listening to what you're saying, that really bothers me. And I'd like to see people rather than just trying to force their opinions through, really try to listen to what it is that other people are saying, because the quantum mind is weak to projection. It's very easy to assume that other people feel the exact same way that we do, when this is not always the case. And there's a lot of value that comes out of working to try to understand where other people are coming from.
You've turned this somewhat into, I don't call it like a movement or religion that you're kind of separating, because you have what I would say, somewhat classical Hindu understanding of reincarnation, but you've separated it where you're not, and I know you were, so to say, a famous yoga teacher, but you have a separate system of belief purely based on reincarnation, and I find that interesting. And you think, just thinking about reincarnation will help people. I served one rabbi. He used to always, yell in Yiddish to people, ask them questions. He's like, "Nicht kein Hefkerwelt, wie jeder Mensch meint der Kantine was will." You're saying it's not a free world where every person can just do as they want. We're basically telling people, like, there is a God that runs the world. It is impossible to sin and get away with it. There is no such concept of sinning and getting away with it. And although we have to make a strenuous effort to be good people, to create the world that we want. And reincarnation's a science. Just thinking about it will cause people to change their action, because it's a more settled outcome. Like, say you mentioned the Christian, Judeo-Christian, like, okay, I'm a young earth creationist, and I don't think the world's going to be here another few hundred years from now. I think the world was only created for 6,000 years, and the world was created for man, and so we could burn a bunch of oil and ruin the environment, or so on and so on, based on a certain theology where you're connecting. And I know that because I'm active in the Hare Krishna movement, and I know a lot of people that were basically do-gooders, environmentalists, and social conscious people, and then they discovered the Hare Krishna movement and decided that it's a more active way to make the world a better place through you're preaching this theology than actively you're working on issues like doing protests about water purity and stuff like that. Going through the normal political means is somewhat useless, and what we need is mass enlightenment and a paradigm shift. And so you've looked through and saw that this reincarnation is extremely important to the way people understand the world. And atheism, where people maybe, God forbid, just feel that it doesn't matter what they do. And so I appreciate that, and what you're trying to do, and spread to light reincarnation. And if you want to respond, I want to ask you at least one more question about transcendentalism.
Thanks. Yeah, everyone has different opinions on how to make the world a better place, and I guess I do believe that reincarnation is central to that, because it has a very humbling effect. And at the end of the day, you cannot really get away with sinning, and that's probably an unsettling idea. But the fact of it is that there isn't a sin in the sense that most people understand it. The sin is willful ignorance. And sometimes you have to spend a long time suffering before you can realize, okay, I'm tired of this. You can't really skip steps, and everyone's going to spend time miserable, suffering. And all I'm hoping to do is to give people an awareness that eventually, when they want to come home and realize the true nature of consciousness and have their existential questions answered, that there is a place for them, and that we can answer those questions because we're using a scientific approach, which it has verifiable predictions and certainly is in keeping with the existing scientific models to the best of my ability, because unfortunately not all the scientific models are true. But I really appreciate the opportunity to come on this channel and talk to you and the audience as well. And they've been giving a lot of really good commentary, not too many trolls. So I guess we managed to scare off the trolls this time.
Well, you're a transcendentalist from what I understood, and for the audience, say we talked if say God, so to say, is the laws of karma, or could God go beyond the laws of karma? That we might have our good and bad deeds, and God is limited by this, and our karma has to be dealt with as law of conservation, or that God could go beyond the scales of the laws of conservation, and due to repentance or good deeds or pure heart or will, when you said the desire could outweigh that, in essence you're saying that there is such a thing as transcendence, and you think that desire could transcend the normal laws of conservation, however that's possible.
I don't think you'd ever be violating conservation laws. And I think there's two different questions in there. One is relating to the nature of God, and one is relating to the nature of transcending consciousness. So human consciousness is subjective. It's only one subset of the total universe. And I do believe that by following the knowledge path and inquiring about the nature of your consciousness and studying it diligently will eventually lead you to answers about the nature of that consciousness, and eventually move your consciousness into a state where it's very calm, it's very expansive, and you can call that transcendent, because even though you have an ego and you have desires, you don't identify with them. Every human body has desires. For example, the desire to go to the bathroom is not a desire you can ignore. So it's not about negating desire, it's about fully understanding desire. And as regards God and the laws of the universe, I find it's hard to talk about, because I'm coming at it from a perspective of basically going against atheists. And I don't really like the idea that I'm kind of coming into someone's existing religion and bossing around telling them how they have to perceive God, because I believe that different people have the right to kind of conceptualize God how they want. But my answer to atheists is that you cannot, you have to accept that there is something godlike about the periodic table and the universe itself. The universe created everything that you see today. Everything that you see is a modulation of the periodic table and the laws of karma. So if you consider the universe to be God, then that means that God's laws are laws like gravity, entropy, uncertainty, and electricity. And therefore, you could say that if those laws are equal to God, karma is something a little bit different, because it relates to the specific cause and effect of the living mind. So what you would say is that God created the system of karma, because the laws of the universe create all the derivative laws. Even though there's no law about karma in my list of fundamental universal laws, it is possible to derive the concept of karma from those fundamental laws. So in terms of that, I would say that I'm really only looking to convince atheists, because I find like when people are coming at it from an atheist perspective, it's really destructive to the conversation, because they're just trying to negate everything, just saying, no, when you're dead, that's it, game over, there's no point to life, and then it just ends up being nihilistic materialism. And I see that as a real problem. I don't see necessarily every religion as causing social problems, and I think in pretty much every case it's better to have a religion than no religion. So I don't know if that makes it more clear. Like, I don't want to say this is God and this has to be your only interpretation of God and there's no room for any other interpretations, because I kind of feel like that's maybe violating other people's free will a little bit.
Yeah, well, I'd put it in, the conservation fact of, when you said will or desire could, so to say, transcend the normal karmatic processes of the soul re-entering the same bloodline or something like that. Is there some law of conservation in reincarnation, that reincarnation is basically serving this function of conserving these forces? And if you're transcendent as a believer or in the power of will, could that upset the forces, or just a rebalancing of conservation, or so to say that your will could be so strong, or God could fulfill something that the scales of whatever is being balanced are irrelevant or could be affected from the spiritual way in a way that we don't perceive.
As a human, you can't override God's laws. Like, I couldn't create a system where I could violate the law of gravity. I have to function within God's laws. And the most that I can aspire to is to align my consciousness with the universal consciousness, if you can call it that, to bring it into a state of calm and non-differentiated awareness versus the differentiated awareness, which is what most people identify with, is this idea of us versus them, or me versus the world. That's a sort of a limiting way of looking at things, because ultimately we're all children of God. We all come from the same place.
Well, it's the God who
Very
listens and
general sense.
interacts to prayer, where if you believe that, okay, we can't violate God's law, but God could violate God's law, and that we could pray to God, and on our behalf, God could violate, so to say, the God's law that we have to live by and answer our prayers.
I've never seen any evidence that God's laws can change. I mean, if God has if God has a localized consciousness, then I suppose that means that God could do whatever God wants. But I'm approaching it from a scientific, I guess I don't want to say scientific materialism, maybe scientific realism. And if I go into the domain of a personal God, i.e. a God that has a personality of some kind, i.e. a God that would intervene due to a conscious choice that God made to intervene, I'm kind of going off of what it is that I'm trying to do. So I want to encourage people to study this stuff. I want to encourage people to make their own decisions and to use their free will, and not to just necessarily go along with whatever it is that I say or whatever it is that anyone else says. Like, I want people to own their religion. I want them to say, I believe this for these reasons, and I'm happy with that. And I accept that maybe it's not the same as what other people feel, but we're all, I think, ultimately, ideally, on a quest for truth. And over time, as we gain understanding, hopefully we'll be able to have a more unitary version of that truth, rather than disparate versions that are warring with each other for egotistical reasons. But at the same time, we have to have compassion for ourselves, because we're humans, we're flawed. We've made tons of mistakes, more mistakes than anyone could ever count. We've all made. And at some stage, you have to accept yourself for who you are and take a journey inward to really discover what is the nature of who you are, because there's an illusory aspect to consciousness that makes assessing its fundamental nature very difficult. So there's really no end to the value to conversations like this, because it allows for people who haven't thought of things to think of them. And thinking about something is the first step towards internalizing it. Our beliefs are the result of thoughts that have become internalized and more calcified over time. And we use logic and science as a way to judge our beliefs so that they can be made more harmonious with nature, and so that we can reach a state of peace, because we're no longer fighting against the laws of nature. We're learning them, we're mastering them, and we're figuring out how to align our will with the universal will. And this brings a tremendous amount of happiness, even just having the intention to improve yourself, even if you're not at a very high level of realization and a lot of things are confusing for you. If you gather together the will, that will cause your consciousness to become more focused. And over time, you're going to internalize that focus, so your future thoughts will be more pure. Over time, we're looking to just get better. Ideally, I would love a society where everybody was enlightened and every single day was pure pleasure, and the food was fresh and delicious and untainted, and everybody's intentions were 100% pure. And that's my ideal for humanity. And I know that it's unrealistic, and I don't care, because I'm an idealist, and I don't feel that there's any need to apologize for that, because even if my goal is unrealistic, even if I achieve, let's say, 10% of my goal, that's still a huge improvement for all sentient life, because the quantum mind is non-local to some extent, i.e. it can expand past the confines of the body. And in that sense, we are affected deeply by the state of mind of other people. And so by uplifting others, we're actually creating a situation where we ourselves will be much happier, because everyone is now looking towards this one unitary goal, rather than an ego-driven, I'm better than you, muscle flex, and battle of grand narratives, which is what kind of plays into the reincarnating over and over into the same basic conflict.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. And it's I don't know if you're kind of like a yoga preacher, summarize it into a comprehensive system of self-actualization and fulfillment. Is where I'm more intellectual man of ideas and research. And I appreciate you pointing me in this direction of research. I had a lot of insights just while we were talking, and I'm thinking in my own head about how this might apply to my conception of God in terms of relation to a God who answers prayer and interacts with the world. And so this is an issue I'm going to continue to research. There's a lot of literature on it. There's a lot of theories. There's whole news outlets and reports and seminars. And I'm not sure if you want to keep on talking, or you want to wrap it up.
We should probably wrap it up pretty soon. It's a pretty demanding for me from a psychic standpoint to talk about this stuff. Even though I'm very happy to talk about it, it takes a lot of focus for me, because I want to make sure that people can internalize the ideas in a logical way. So yeah, maybe we can just see if there's any remaining questions, and then say goodbye for now. But definitely leave the door open if people are interested to talk about these subjects more. Truly, there are no stupid questions. Like, I get trolled all the time. I don't mind. I find it funny. I feel like community is an important part of spirituality. So if I have to fend off some trolls from time to time, I'm able to see the humor in it, and hopefully please people by making them laugh. And that pleases me a lot. So I'm really happy that the comments on the stream have all pretty much been very positive, and a lot of good questions. So I encourage people, don't be shy. Like, if you're thinking of a question, probably other people are as well, and they just don't. We all have a fear that we're going to look stupid if we say something. But really, it's the internet. Everybody's probably done something on the internet that was maybe not the best choice, but I don't focus on that. I don't hold grudges. So please feel free to put the questions out there, because maybe it's something I haven't thought of yet and that needs to be answered. So when you can participate in the spiritual process and the intellectual process, that's building a community for a future culture that's going to make the world a much happier place to live in. You can't get away from the importance of community in religion. It's not something that you can just do on your own for the most part. Although a lot of religious practice is done alone, the community is an integral part to the realization. Having friends that see things the same way you do and are on essentially the same path, there's no treasure more valuable to an unenlightened person. And the Buddha's asked for both of us. We think we might be on our last incarnation. Personally, I can choose when I take birth, so I would be looking to probably take birth again under circumstances where I could make a big difference spiritually and intellectually. So, like, let's say some people that were followers of mine in this life went down a bad path and they were abusing the teachings and they were using them for terrible reasons and causing lots of suffering, I would come back and I would do something that would hopefully make them sufficiently demotivated from doing it again, because in the end it's about incentivizing people towards purity. But in terms of my own desires, I don't have much desires in me other than I like to alleviate the burden of suffering for other people. That's a very, that warms my heart. It always pleases me greatly to see people make spiritual progress. So it's, I guess if I can do that, it's always worth taking another trip down to Earth.
Yeah, I'm you know, Sam, I'm more independent, intellectual, management behind the scenes, uh, type. So for me, I could talk hours on end just about ideas, and I'm, less of a people's person, more of an ideas person. Um, I find that, interesting. I'm still in the research stage. Reincarnation is very interesting to me. Like, I've done a lot of research. There's a lot of interfaith implications. I think a lot of theological thought and understanding of interfaith and traditions is related to these concepts of reincarnation, the soul. Although, personally, I'm more scientific, so I have to say I'm still in the information gathering phase. When I first started going to the Hare Krishna temple, I saw that the Indian body people, when they sing happy birthday to each other, would, say that, may you never take birth again. And to me at the beginning, that seemed very negative. And I even know, Prabhupada's priest at Scottish Church College, Father Euchard, I have his book, and he called it The Pessimism of Hinduism. And he also probably applied to Buddhism, where he looked at Eastern religions as basically very negative, and that's why that had a very pessimistic outlook of life in the human life, and hence the goal was to not take birth again, to be annulled, and that, maybe there's a higher inclination. A lot of Hindus don't have that, would claim that they're not pessimistic in that way. But to me, that's not my understanding, that I want this to be my last incarnation. I'm more, believe in resurrection of the dead, and messianic period, where it's saying, yes, all the troubles we have in this life right now, and we're all suffering from the harsh conditions of the material world, but at some point this utopian society will exist, and all the righteous people of previous generations will stand shoulder to shoulder in service of the same God, without any of the problems that prevented us from doing so in the current state of life. So from that perspective, I'm more of a classical biblical believer that would say, no, I don't want this to be my last incarnation. I want to be included from that period where all righteous people stand on the earth together in service of God, without any holdups that prevented us from doing it in the current state.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to put it. And I also think that if people are not interested in learning how to become enlightened, I don't think people should be pressured into doing that. I think it's just good to have the option there when, because like you say, not everyone's ready to stop living. We've been alive for a very, very, very long time. And it's sort of silly to think that you could just nullify that within a short time span, or that you'd even want to. I think people should enjoy life, be happy, don't necessarily think about attaining enlightenment until you truly desire it. And the desire will come with time. There's really no rush. That we're not going anywhere. Everything that's here has been here for a very long time, and God does not want us to suffer. It's not built in that we need to be having the worst possible time to atone for anything. We have the power in ourselves to master a good human life, even if it means coming back many times to have a really great life. We don't see anything wrong with that. We just want to put people on the path that will eventually get them to the realization of their desires, as well as the supreme realization, which is the the idea of becoming enlightened, which is the idea of perfecting your mind to such a point that it never drops back to an unenlightened state. You sort of state transition and remain in a very relaxed, happy, calm state. And I like this quote from the Buddha in the chat: small minds discuss people, average minds discuss things, great minds discuss ideas. We're probably never going to be able to get away entirely from the personality drama that always occurs in the internet circles, but hopefully we can inject our positivity and knowledge into that discussion so that over time people make a conscious choice that discussing ideas is actually better for their soul. Maybe over time people will move away from the silliness a little bit, but it is part of the human experience, and I wouldn't want anyone to deny how they feel. I actually want just the opposite. I want everyone to fully embrace and own it and be proud of who you are, and don't be shy to learn more.
Okay, Jennifer, I really appreciate you coming on, spreading a positive message on my channel, for referring me to the Penrose Hameroff model and to research this further. I'll continue to be researching on this. If I find some good slides or PowerPoints, I might do another stream. It's hard to kind of conceptualize these ideas. I don't even have the time or the ability to make good PowerPoints, but I'll search the web, and if some of the designers of these theories have public PowerPoints online, I might do another stream just going over some of the research on it. And if you have more thoughts or advancements, want to come time to time and chat on the channel, or if you run into someone else interesting doing similar research and want to make a chat, you're always welcome, Jennifer. And I assume we'll see each other on different chats, and till the next time we meet.
Sounds great. Yeah, I hope everyone gets a chance to look at the other video that David made, because it was very informative, and it went over a lot of the different aspects of the existing quantum mind theory. So it's definitely worth a watch.
And like usual, hopefully tonight or tomorrow by the latest, I'll timestamp a table of contents in the video. So if anyone looks at it, they'll be able to look in the description and to some level see the various topics we discussed and click straight to those.
Great. Well, thanks again, and we'll say goodbye for now. And goodbye to the chat. Thanks everyone for participating, and please feel free to bring your questions next time. We'll be more than happy to discuss them, and you might give us a chance to think about something we hadn't thought about before.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we're streaming is to try to create a community of like minds. We're in search of people who like these concepts and want to research and talk about it more. So have a great night, everyone.
Good night.